Hi everyone, I'm Sonia and you're watching my channel Sonia Psychology Classes. Today in this video, we are going to start with a new topic, that is stereotypes. Very interesting. Stereotypes. Before we start with the topic stereotypes, there is this small riddle, very interesting, I want you to solve. So the riddle goes like this. A father and son get in a car crash and are rushed to the hospital. The father dies. The boy is taken to the operating room and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy because he's my son. How is this possible? Well, I give you 5 seconds to give me the right answer. Or you may just pause the video and think on the answer. Well, the answer is that the surgeon was boy's mother. So tell me in comment section below how many of you could not solve the riddle, or if you were able to. So if you were not able to solve the riddle, thinking that how is it possible because father died and how he can be a surgeon then? That means you were caught in a stereotype. Because as soon as I said surgeon, a figure of a male might have occurred in your mind. So that's a stereotype. We tend to generalize some things in our mind. Like if I say teacher, most likely female will come to your mind. If I say cooking, person changing diaper, cleaning house, a woman will come to your mind. And if I say driver, banker, doctor, most likely a male will come in your mind. This is because we have been conditioned like that. The term stereotype was first used in a psychological sense by Lippmann 1922, who defined stereotypes as little pictures in our heads that help us interpret what we see. Arson 2008 claims that when we stereotype, we allow these pictures to dominate our thinking, causing us to assign identical characteristics to any person in a group. Now, stereotypes often takes place unconsciously and automatically. We place people into categories based upon our previous experiences with similar people using our existing schemas. So, are stereotypes is a good thing or a bad thing? Well, both. How stereotypes are beneficial? Our social world is very complex and thus presents us with too much of information. Since our capacity to process this information is limited, our social world needs to be simplified. And one way to avoid this information overload is through social categorization. Now, the information is used in social categorization is stereotypes. This generalization may either be positive or negative based on certain group membership or physical attributes. However, most stereotypes of today are negative, exaggerating the quality and cognitively associating such traits to all individuals that are part of the group, leading to discrimination and prejudice, thus increasing self-esteem about themselves and their in-group. Like, for example, blacks dance really well. Women are organized and more into cleaning. Men are not good at showing emotions, etc. Well, now let's understand some in-depth details and types of stereotypes. First is Campbell's grain of truth. Grain of truth hypothesis, it states that stereotypes can be formed from a person's own experience with that group of people. The grain of truth hypothesis, which states that one experience with an individual, meeting a girl who is bad at maths, for example, causes that conclusion to be generalized to a group. All girls are bad at math. This means that stereotypes are based loosely on reality. The reality is, however, that a single experience of one person from a particular demographic is not enough to make a sweeping generalization to the entire group. But we still do it though. When we have a stereotype in our mind, even though things are not true and it doesn't apply at all, there is always this one grain of truth underneath, under that heap of grains, which is true. For example, boys are good at math and girls are bad at math. Well, we don't agree to that, but let's go back in history a few decades back when men were the bread earners and would spend most of their time working, earning for family, while women at home was busy raising kids, looking after the house. So over a period of time, men and women's brain got hardwired because of neuroplasticity and hardwiring. Men started becoming better at math because they would deal with accounts, with finance of house, and women became better at multitasking as they would raise kids, look after the house, and so on. So the grain of truth is definitely there, and maybe at some point they were actually good at math, better than women. But then there are many other factors. Not all men are good at math. Not all women are bad at math. And now both women are studying, getting education, and doing jobs at equal levels. So this now is not true anymore. Women's brain for math could be as sharp as man. So this stereotype is not good. But yes, there has been a grain of truth beneath this heap. Next is gatekeeper theory. Gatekeeper theory states that stereotypes can be formed through gatekeepers like the media, parents, friends, etc. Gatekeeper theory explains how certain individuals or organizations act as gatekeepers controlling the flow of information. These individuals or organizations who make decisions about what information is presented to the public and what is excluded. Gatekeepers' choices can influence the portrayal of various groups in the media. If they consistently prioritize stories that reinforce certain stereotypes, it can contribute to the normalization and perpetuation of these stereotypes. Sometimes, for example, movies and social media show certain kind of stories which normalize these stereotypes. For example, movies like Mrs., feminist agenda film. Some might think it stereotypes that all housewives are unhappy. Or Netflix series like Adolescents, which might generalize that social media is bad and kids always end up doing something disaster if exposed to social media. Now, IB students need to write supporting studies for their answer. So let's do some supporting studies. The very first study is by Ford and Stranger, 1992. The aim of the study was to investigate whether there is a grain of truth in stereotypes. Experiment was, they asked psychology students to participate in an experiment in exchange for course credit. They presented the booklets of behavioral descriptions of two fictitious groups, blue and red. Descriptions related to either friendly, intelligent, or other behaviors. Differences between other groups were emphasized. That is, the blue group had more description of friendly but less intelligent behaviors. Example, a member of the blue group failed his driving test for the 4th time, and vice versa. Findings were, when later asked to give spontaneous characteristics or characterizations of the group, participants characterized the groups in terms of their differences. This supported the idea that stereotypes originate in experience of group differences and must contain at least a grain of truth. Their research showed that participants tended to categorize groups in terms of small truths in the written description, and this was then abstracted by participants to best differentiate between the two groups. So a red group becomes stereotyped as friendly, while a blue group gets stereotyped as intelligent, or vice versa. It didn't take much to cause the stereotypes to form, only a small grain of truth. Now let's study one more concept here, that is illusionary correlations. It is common for people to see two variables as related when they are not. So when you think that there is a correlation between two variables, but in reality there is no correlation between the two. This is known as illusionary correlation. Common example of illusionary correlation include a student believing that all Asians are good at maths because he sits next to a very able Asian mathematician student. Or a woman believing that all pit bull dogs are dangerous because she has read one article on an aggressive pit bull. Or a footballer putting his left boot on first before every match because he scored a goal the first time he did this. So illusionary correlation is seeing a relationship between two things when none exists. This is particularly likely to happen when two rare events co-occur. For example, crime and blackness. Such kind of things like illusionary correlation, I feel, is also the reason for superstitions that we believe in. For example, just because you met with an accident cause you had washed your hair on Thursday. Now these two events co-occurred and it's a rare thing. Though these two variables have absolutely no link with each other. Accident has nothing to do with your washing your hair that day. But since two rare events happen together, a person starts to believe that never wash your hair on so and so day of week, else something bad can happen. So the illusionary correlation is closely related to the grain of truth hypothesis because it suggests a human tendency to see a relationship between unrelated variables like gender and driving ability or ethnicity and intelligence. For example, if an individual meets a Canadian, relatively rare in the global population, and that Canadian turns out to be a hockey player, also a relatively rare sport, then a stereotype may be formed that all Canadians play hockey. It doesn't matter. The stereotype is false or illusionary because once that stereotype develops, it influences our behavior. The illusionary correlation essentially means that negative behaviors like violent crime are rare and so are minority groups by definition. So when both happen together, they are noticed disproportionately. They stand out, then they are correlated, then a stereotype is born. This is how minority groups may be more stereotyped as criminal than a majority group. Illusionary correlation is defined as people's tendencies to overestimate relationships between two groups when distinctive and unusual information is presented. Illusionary correlation is based on system 1 thinking, specifically the availability heuristics, that is, decisions are made based on first what comes to their mind. As human beings, we are rather obsessed with a very simple question, why? We infer causality based on very limited evidence. For example, John goes against his better judgment and watches Netflix until 1 a.m. He then gets into an argument with his boss the next day at work. He assumes that it is because he watched Netflix until 1 a.m. that he had the argument with his boss. We often make decisions based on a limited amount of information. We often rely on system 1 thinking, making decisions based on heuristics, that is cognitive shortcuts. In this case, we use the availability heuristics, using easily recalled pairings of people and behavior to make a judgment. I'll give you another example. For example, people tend to think that a change in weather leads to arthritis pain. They can easily recall when the weather changed and this happened. But in a study by Redmiller and Tversky, they found no such correlation. However, they did find a high belief in this correlation. There are two types of illusionary correlation we'll study. One is expectancy-based and distinctiveness-based illusionary correlation. Expectancy-based illusionary correlation occurs when we mistakenly see relationships due to our pre-existing expectations surrounding them. In other words, I notice that a librarian is quiet and I assume this is because librarians are quiet people or introverts. This is a form of confirmation bias. I see what I expect to see and this strengthens my belief. If I see something that doesn't match that expectation, I either forget about it or I rationalize that it is an exception to the rule, something known as the discounting principle. Next is distinctiveness-based illusionary correlation. It happens when a relationship is believed to exist between two variables due to focusing too much on information that stands out. It is this type of correlation that Hamilton and Gifford investigated in their classic study. So now we are clear with the concept. Let's do one supporting study for the same. Hamilton and Gifford 1976 carried out an experiment with 70 American undergraduate, 35 females and 35 males. Participants were shown a series of slides, each with a statement about a member of one of two groups, simply called Group A and Group B. There were twice as many people in Group A, that is 26 were there, and Group B 13. So Group B was the minority group. The participants were told that Group B was smaller than Group A before starting the experiment. Each statement was about one individual in one of the two groups. The statement was either positive or negative. Each group had the same proportion of positive and negative comments. Now, the participants were then asked to rank members of each group on a series of 20 traits. For example, popular, social, intelligent, etc. After completing this task, they were given a booklet in which they were given a statement and then asked whether the person who did this was from group A or group B. Finally, they were asked how many of the statements for each group had been undesirable. Half of the group changed the order of measuring the dependent variables in order to avoid interference effects. So the booklet was completed before the trait rankings. The results are as follows. On the trait ratings, Group A was ranked higher than Group B for positive traits and lower for negative traits. In the booklet, participants correctly recalled more positive traits for Group A, that is 74%, than Group B, 54%, and more negative traits for Group B, that is 65%, than Group 55%. Participants overestimated the number of negative traits in the minority group, but this finding was not significantly significant. Hamilton and Gifford argued that this was because the minority group was by nature smaller in number. Their negative behaviors appeared more distinct and appeared to be representative of the group. So, one minority male is caught stealing and it appears to be related to the fact that he is a minority. This demonstrates why negative stereotypes may be more common for minority groups than for the majority. Such research has led to the modern practice in many countries for not to report the race or ethnicity of people who have been charged with a crime. I hope you understood the study well. Now let's do one counter-argument study which IB students might need to write in their discuss and to what extent command term. Riddle-Muir and Tversky, 1996. So the counter study goes like this. Illusionary correlation, the researchers followed 18 patients with arthritis for 18 months. Patients were asked to record their pain and joint tenderness while researchers documented changes in the weather. Nearly all patients believed that their condition was associated with weather changes, when the actual correlation was near zero. Now, these participants need to be reminded that we are likely to recall instances that confirm our beliefs. There is a widespread and strongly held belief that arthritis pain is influenced by the weather. However, scientific studies have found no consistent association. We hypothesize that this belief results in part at least from people's tendency to perceive patterns where none exist. We studied patients, 18 in number, for more than 1 year and found no statistically significant associations between their arthritis pain and the weather conditions implicated by each individual. Now, we also found that college students, 97 in number, tend to perceive correlations between uncorrelated random sequences. This departure of people's intuitive notion of association from the statistical concept of association, we suggest, contributes to the belief that arthritis pain is influenced by the weather. Now let's do the evaluation of the study. The researchers created two groups, A and B, for which there would be no pre-existing stereotypes. This increased the levels of internal validity. It was, however, highly artificial, meaning that ecological validity was low. We cannot know to what extent this predicts the development of stereotypes under natural conditions. In real life, there is much more context to making stereotypes. This could include economic competition, legitimate or unwarranted fear of others, institutionalization, racism or prejudice, and or actual experiences with members of the other group. The study was a repeated measure design. The IVs were the positive or negative statements and the size of each group. The conditions were concurrent. This means that there were not two distinct conditions run separately. Now, this eliminates the variable of participant variability. All participants took part in all aspects of the study. Although the findings do show a difference between the positive and negative traits attributed to each group, the findings were not all significant. There have been practical applications of this study. For example, it has been found that doctors tend to over-remember poor health practices in obese patients compared to other patients. Marian Andrus 1999, it suggests that stigmatized patients suffer more from an illusionary correlation bias than do non-stigmatized patients. The next subtopic is effects of stereotypes. Stereotypes have a wide range of influences on human behavior. They can lead to biases, distortion, generalization, and they can unconsciously affect judgment and memory, which in turn affects our behavior. Under this comes self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's understand what is self-fulfilling prophecy. Schemas and stereotypes can cause people to change the way that they think about themselves and influence their behavior. In some instances, people can unconsciously change their behavior, causing the schema to become true. This is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. I will give you an example so that you understand better. To make you understand, for example, there is a student who is just maybe average or above average in reality. Okay, but the teacher thinks or believes that he's very bright and smart and starts giving a lot of attention to that child. Cause of her, this belief and unintentional favors him more, so this leads to better performance of the child in exams. In reality, he was just average, but due to a belief of a teacher and her behavior, her belief turned into reality and the child did actually well. Another example, let's say there is a fitness coach who believes in a stereotype that men perform or are more serious in physical workouts as compared to women. And due to the stereotype that he carries or believes in, he starts focusing more on men than women in the gym. Hence, as a result, obviously, men outperform women here. So here the reality was something else, but schemas and stereotype change the thinking and influence the behavior. This is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. I hope it's clear. Now let's do one supporting study for self-fulfilling prophecy. Rosenthal and Jacobson 1968 conducted a classic study that demonstrated the self-fulfilling prophecy. Teachers in an elementary school were told by researchers that certain students were likely to be growth spurters or academic bloomers in the next academic year based upon results of an academic test. The test did not actually exist and the students predicted to be bloomers were chosen at random. Any difference between students was therefore in how they were now perceived by their teachers. The researchers observed the classroom dynamics throughout the year, and at the end of the year, the students were given an IQ test. Students that were labeled as bloomers demonstrated an increase in IQ, gaining higher scores than their peers. It appears that teachers' perceptions of the students' ability affected the way that the teachers interacted with the students, making the predictions of the students' ability become true. Later studies have discovered that teachers create a warmer learning environment for bloomers, allowing them more time to answer questions. They also give bloomers, more and better feedback on their completed assignments. Kind of a biasness that happens. So when looking at this research, we must consider what happens if we apply a label to a group of people on the societal level. If we consider women less able at mathematics or African Americans less able at science, it may affect their future life chances. Few opportunities in these areas may be offered to them, and this may affect future job prospects and earning potential. With fewer women and African Americans pursuing jobs in the areas utilizing these skills, the label may be seen to carry some level of credibility, in this way reinforcing the label and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Next topic is stereotype threat. What does it mean? Stereotype threat is the idea that people feel at risk of conforming to stereotypes about themselves. Stereotype threat is a major topic in social psychology. It refers to the idea that people are sometimes either at risk or feel at risk of conforming to stereotypes about themselves. I'll give you an example. For example, a man may not communicate his feelings well if he is aware of the stereotype that men are bad at being in touch with and communicating their emotions. The same thing might happen on a maths test. Again, if a woman feels at a risk of conforming to a stereotype that women aren't as good as mathematical thinking. It doesn't really matter that the stereotypes aren't true, because stereotype threat says that the stereotype itself pressures a negative performance. Basically, the man communicates his feelings poorly, or the woman performs poorly on the maths test because of the stereotype threat. It's like the pressure of vulnerability. Stereotype threat refers to the anxiety and apprehension experienced by an individual or members of a particular group when they start believing that their behavior in a specific situation may confirm and reinforce an existing negative group stereotype. There are many explanations as to why someone may underperform on a maths or science test, such as fatigue or lack of resources, but Steele and his colleagues claim that group stereotypes cause an individual to re-evaluate his or her behavior in relation to the stereotype, often leading to underperformance. The researchers argue that our social identities, old, young, male, female, white man, female teacher, and so on, become more significant when we are in specific situations. In turn, our social identity may affect the factors that we have to deal with in specific situation. Now, Steele and his colleagues call these factors identity contingencies. They claim that identity contingencies are the circumstances that we must deal with in order to get the desired outcome from a situation. Again, for an example, a woman about to sit for a maths test may be aware of the commonly held negative stereotype of the link between women and poor mathematics performance. Now, in turn, the anxiety that she feels as a result of this stereotype, this may affect her subsequent performance on the test. This may manifest itself in a variety of ways, including poor concentration, increased heart rate, which will result in inferior performance. Let's do one very famous and interesting study as a supporting study for stereotype threat. Steele and Aronson carried out a study to show how stereotype threat may affect an individual's test performance. Now, the aim of the study was to see how stereotype threat affects test performance in African Americans. Steele and Aronson defined stereotype threat as being at risk of confirming as self-characteristic a negative stereotype about one's group. The sample was made up of 114 male and female, black and white undergraduates from Stanford University. There were two independent variables in the study: the race of the participant and the test descriptions. Now, the participants were given a standardized test of verbal ability, similar to the SAT, and they were told one of the two things. First, it is a test to diagnose your intellectual ability. Second, it is a test for your problem-solving skills. In the first condition, the focus was on verbal ability. In the second condition, it was on problem-solving. Now, participants were randomly assigned to one of the two conditions. However, they made sure that there were equal number of participants in each condition. The following graph here you can see shows the mean test scores under each condition. There was no significant difference between male and female participants, so gender is not included. There were two experimental conditions. Condition 1 was that condition 1 was stereotype threat condition. In this condition, the test was described as being a measure of intellectual ability. This would cause the negative racial stereotype to become relevant to the black participants and establish stereotype threat. Condition 2, the non-stereotype threat condition. The test was merely described as a problem-solving task that was unrelated to intellectual ability. This should have not established any stereotype threat. Okay. Now, as you can see, African Americans did poorly when they believed that the test was a test of their intellectual ability, but did just as well as the white Americans when they believed that it was a test of their problem-solving skills. In other words, African American participants performed less well than their white counterparts in the stereotype threat condition, but in the non-threat condition, their performance equaled that of their white counterparts. Let's do the evaluation of the study. The sample was made up of Stanford University students, so it may not be representative and thus difficult to generalize the findings. Number two, the study made use of an independent sample designs. Verbal scores from participant SAQs were collected prior to the study in order to make sure that they were all within the norm of verbal performance and baseline. In this way, participant variability was minimized. However, a matched pair design may have been a better approach. 3. Although there is a difference between the two average scores, it does not necessarily mean that the participants experience stereotype threat. Their salience about their racial identity and their levels of stress during the exam were not measured in this first variation of the experiment. Later variations of the experiment showed, however, that this was most probably the case. Fourth, according to Steele, stereotype threat turns on spotlight anxiety. What is that? Fear of failure, which causes emotional distress and pressure that may undermine performance. Students under the stereotype threat often underperform, and this can naturally limit their educational prospects. Next, this is the phenomena where people tend to overestimate how much others notice aspects of one's appearance or behavior. This causes a lot of social anxiety for people. Next topic is stereotype promise. Stereotype promise is the idea that positive stereotypes may improve an individual's performance on certain tasks, and offers the idea that stereotypes allow us to simplify information about the world and are therefore advantageous to us. Now, the opposite of stereotype threat is known as stereotype promise, and it offers an alternative view of the effects of stereotypes. As representations that save on cognitive processing, stereotypes are advantageous and even necessary for any individual to handle the complexity of incoming information from the external world. Beyond that, it also appears as if positive stereotypes may lead to improved performance on certain tasks in exactly the opposite way that stereotype threat leads to impaired performance. Now let's do one supporting study for stereotype promise. This study is given by Jennifer Lee and Minzo, conducted a longitudinal study in California investigating stereotypes related to Asian Americans and academic achievement. The stereotype holds that students of Asian ethnicity are smart, disciplined, and high achieving. Lee, as cited in Kaplan 2015, and this affected how teachers and counselors interacted with them. Lee and Zone 2015 interviewed 4,800 first-generation Americans in the Los Angeles area and found that Asian American students were more likely to be directed towards advanced classes and selective colleges, and this heightened expectation and obviously the opportunity as well appears to have led to higher achievement, partly as a result of the stereotype. This is somewhat paradoxical, as stereotypes are typically thought of having a negative effect on our behavior. Mexican American students were more likely to be affected by stereotype threat, as they felt they were not taken seriously as students and were not directed to advanced classes of selective colleges. Now, the main implication of this study is that it seriously challenges any assumptions and that achievement gaps in education are due to culture. Now, Lee and Zhou's 2015 findings indicate that the mere perception of culture in the form of a stereotype may influence behavior as much as culture itself. In this case, the stereotype of higher academic achievement in Asian Americans may have led to high achievement. Stereotype promise functions as the opposite of stereotype threat. Furthermore, American perceptions of Asian culture may be inaccurate, as Asian immigrants to the US tend to be hyper-selected. As Lee has cited this, immigrants from China and Korea, for example, are more likely to hold advanced academic degrees and higher skills than other immigrant groups to the US. In other words, Asian immigrants are not exactly a representative sample of their home cultures and countries. So stereotypes about Asian Americans are not really accurate. The same stereotype might made of a complementary segment of the most skilled and most educated, like European Americans or African Americans. Now, both the stereotype threat and stereotype promise evidence the ways that stereotypes may be internalized to become a part of an individual's personal and social identity, and so influence their behavior in negative and positive ways, depending upon whether the stereotype is threatening or promising. So I hope you liked my video and you understood the stereotype chapter really well. If you have any questions, please feel free to write in the comments below. And if you liked my video, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. If you have any questions regarding the topic or any other questions regarding psychology or IB psychology exams or ERQs, SAQs, whatever it is, please do write in your comments below.